She was young, experienced, and trusted, not just by her team, but by the orcas she trained every single day. But on the morning of July 8, 2002, during what was supposed to be a routine session at SeaWorld San Diego, everything changed in an instant. To killer whales, Orchid and Splash suddenly dragged senior trainer Tamarie Tollison beneath the water. What happened next was nearly fatal. And the aftermath. It sparked a storm of questions SeaWorld hoped would never reach the public. This is the story SeaWorld never wanted you to hear. Welcome to Animal Legends, the channel, where we uncover the shocking truths behind some of the world's most terrifying animal encounters. If stories like this intrigue you, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening documentaries. But first, who was Tamarie Tollison? At just 28 years old, Tamarie was already a senior orca trainer at SeaWorld San Diego, a position that required not only skill, but deep trust. She wasn't just respected by her peers, she was admired. The orcas, especially Orchid and Splash, responded to her in ways that others could only dream of. Tamarie had dedicated her life to the animals at Shamu Stadium, spending thousands of hours training, performing, and building an extraordinary bond with creatures many people only saw from a distance to visitors. The orcas were majestic, massive, mysterious, and awe-inspiring to Tamarie. They were companions. She had mastered their behaviors, learned to sense their moods, and earned a level of trust that was both rare and fragile. She worked almost daily with Orchid and Splash. Orchid, born in captivity at SeaWorld in 1988, was one of the park's most seasoned orcas, intelligent, quick to respond, but sometimes unpredictable, showing flashes of dominance. Splash, transferred from SeaWorld San Antonio, was a powerful male known for his immense size and strength, but also for his complicated training history. I knew both of them intimately. She respected them deeply, and according to many, she was the model trainer, calm, confident, always in control. She believed in the mission. She believed in the whales. And most of all, she believed that the trust she had earned from these powerful animals was real, but behind the scenes, away from the crowds and music of the shows, there were quiet concerns. In break rooms and locker-lined hallways, trainers whispered about Orchid's behavior. There had been incidents, never public, never fatal, but moments when Orchid pushed the boundaries, moments that left some uneasy. Tamarie knew the risks. Everyone in that stadium did. But to her, the bond was worth it. That morning, July 8th, was supposed to be just another day. A session like dozens before it. But something felt ... off. Could anyone have predicted what was about to happen? Could anyone have stopped it? Because just hours later, the same stadium that had echoed with laughter and applause would fall silent, and Tamarie Tollison would be fighting for her life beneath the surface. It was a Monday morning, July 8th, 2002. The sun had risen bright over SeaWorld San Diego. The air was warm. The park still quiet in those early morning hours before opening. Behind the scenes at Shamu Stadium, the day's first preparations were already underway. For Tamarie Tollison, it was just another shift. She arrived early, walking the same worn concrete path she knew by heart, nodding to colleagues, already prepping for the mid-morning crowd. Everything felt routine, familiar inside the back pools. Orchid and Splash moved in slow, graceful circles slicing through the still water like living shadows. Tamarie had worked with them for years. She knew their signals, their moods, their quirks. That morning's session was simple, basic reinforcement. Training, no audience, no pressure, just trust building and conditioning. Orchid, now 14 years old, was a dominant female, born in captivity, sharp, intelligent, responsive, but with a known stubborn streak. She had once yanked a trainer by the ponytail, no injuries, no headlines. Just a reminder of how quickly a 5,000-pound predator could change the script. Splash. The larger of the two was slower and seemingly gentler, but his past was more complex. He'd been transferred from SeaWorld San Antonio in 1992, and he came with quiet warnings, inconsistent responses, unpredictable energy. Still, that day, both whales seemed calm, engaged, even playful. Tamarie entered the water just as she had hundreds of times before, with confidence, without hesitation. On the deck above, trainers observed with radios clipped to their hips and cue-boards in hand. Everything was controlled, structured, safe, but routines can be deceiving. Tamarie smiled, offered her vocal cues. An orchid began to circle closer. Splash moved silently beneath the surface. That's when something shifted. Not a sudden attack. Not at first. There were no aggressive splashes. No warning vocalizations. Just subtle changes. A shift in posture. A sharper gaze. A flick in movement. Small signals, easy to miss. Even for the most seasoned trainer, would it have made a difference? Because within 5 minutes, that calm, familiar session descended into chaos. Tamarie floated beside Orchid, offering soft commands, gentle signals, a routine she had done countless times. Orchid surfaced in front of her, misting the air with a familiar exhale. Everything appeared normal from above. But then, in an instant, it all changed. Without warning, Orchid lunged, not with overt aggression, but with startling precision. She clamped her jaws around Tamarie's foot, locking on with the sheer force of an apex predator. There was no time to react. One moment, Tamarie was upright and balanced in the water. The next, she was yanked beneath the surface by a 5,000-pound orca. The radios crackled. A trainer shouted from the deck. Then Splash joined in. The massive male surged upward from below, a black and white missile exploding through the water. Now both whales had her. One pulled from above, the other from below, dragging her in. Opposite directions, Tamarie's body twisted violently, her silhouette barely visible through the rippling water from the surface. Trainers could only track shadows. Helpless, horrified, panic swept the deck. Recall, recall. A voice shouted, triggering emergency signals, a last-ditch effort to call the whales back. But they didn't let go. Tamarie fought, thrashed, tried to break free, but she was completely outmatched. The water muffled everything. The alarms, the shouts, even her own screams. All she could see was a blur of black and grey muscle, surging around her. Her lungs burned, her limbs flailed. She reached, desperately, for the surface but nothing. On the deck above, panic erupted. Trainers scrambled for anything: buzzers, food lures, frantic hand slaps on the surface, desperately trying to break the orca's grip. But the pool had become a whirlpool of chaos. For 30 excruciating seconds, Tamarie Tollison vanished beneath the surface of SeaWorld's most iconic tank, and in those long, breathless moments, it seemed like she wasn't coming back. What changed? What made the whales let go? And would Tamarie survive what came next? That answer would only come after one of the most terrifying moments in SeaWorld's history. Beneath the surface of Shamu Stadium, Tamarie was running out of time. Orchid and Splash still had hold of her foot, her arm, her future dot. Then, a critical decision. A senior trainer, eyes locked on the turmoil below, reached for one final tool, a false signal. They gave the vocal cue for Kasatkatha, Park's dominant matriarch, Orca, a name that held power in the tank's social hierarchy. But Kasatka wasn't even there. It was a psychological trigger sound, associated with submission, de-escalation, and yielding. A cue the whales had been conditioned over years to obey, and it worked. Orchid let go first, then Splash released his grip. Seconds later, Tamara's body broke the surface limp, twisted, motionless. For a moment, she didn't move. Then her arms twitched, a ragged gasp, a cough. Her eyes blinked open, wide and unfocused. She was alive, barely. Trainers rushed to her side, hauling her out of the water with stretchers and spine boards, moving as fast as they could. And as they lifted her from the pool, the true horror of her injuries came into view. Her arm was shattered, a compound fracture, bone protruding through torn skin. Her foot was mangled, deep bruises and bite marks covered her torso. Blood stained her wetsuit. And yet, through the shock and the pain, Tamarie remained conscious, barely able to speak, but aware enough to see the chaos surrounding her. Guests near the backstage area had frozen in place, watching through the railings. Some said they didn't understand what they were seeing. Others said they'd never forget the blood on the concrete as Tamarie was rushed through the service gate toward emergency care. But even though she was out of the water, the danger wasn't over. Her body had survived, but the consequences were only just beginning. Would she ever walk again? Would she ever return to the water? And what would SeaWorld do now? Because in the aftermath of the attack, the questions only got darker. Tamarie Tyson was rushed from SeaWorld, San Diego, to a nearby hospital. She had sustained multiple traumatic injuries: a shattered forearm, torn ligaments, deep bruising, and lacerations from the whale's powerful jaws. She was alive but in no condition to speak. In the ER, doctors worked frantically to stabilize her. Pins were inserted to hold her. Armed together, heavy bandages wrapped her foot. She was sedated, drifting in and out of consciousness, her body in shock. But while Tamarie lay in a hospital bed, a different battle had already begun, one she couldn't fight. Inside SeaWorld's management offices, the conversation quickly turned. Not just what happened, but what do we say? According to reports, internal meetings immediately focused on damage control. The wording became critical. Was this a case of animal aggression? Or, as some executives quietly pushed, was it a trainer error, a positioning mistake? It was a familiar playbook, one seen in marine parks across the country. Shift the blame, minimize the optics, protect the brand, because for a company built on the image of harmony between human and whale, an attack like this could be catastrophic, not just to public trust, but to regulatory scrutiny. Official statements were carefully crafted. The public was told only that a trainer had been injured during a routine session. But behind the scenes, the truth was far messier, and it wasn't going to stay buried for long. No mention of being dragged underwater, no acknowledgement that 2 whales were involved, and certainly no word about the emergency recall signal, psychological trigger that may have saved her life. Behind the polished smiles and carefully crafted press releases, the truth was being scrubbed clean. But why? Was this really about Tamarie's safety, or was it about protecting SeaWorld's image? And if it had happened before, how many times had the public been kept in the dark? Because while Tamarie was still lying in a hospital bed, SeaWorld was already moving to bury the story. But the warning signs had been there all along. In the days following the attack, Tamarie Tollison remained in recovery. Her injuries were severe, her future uncertain, but outside her hospital room, a different story was starting to emerge. Whispers spread quietly at first. This wasn't the first time Orca had shown aggression toward trainers. Records would later reveal a troubling history. Orca, born at SeaWorld in 1988, had a known behavioral record. In 1996, she grabbed a trainer by the ponytail and dragged them into the water. There were no serious injuries that time, but the message was clear. She was powerful, she was dominant, and she didn't always follow the rules. And she wasn't alone. Internal reports, once sealed, later exposed detailed multiple red flags, not just with Orca, but with Splash as well. Whales that ignored cues, whales that acted unpredictably, whales that showed signs of agitation during routine sessions. These weren't isolated moments, they were documented patterns. Years later, whistleblowers would expose a culture of silence, a place where speaking up could cost you your job. Trainers who raised safety concerns about in-water interactions were often ignored, silenced, or quietly reassigned, because the show had to go on, and the illusion had to remain intact. Even more damning, internal memos reportedly labeled both Orca and Splash as high risk for in-water work. These weren't just difficult whales, they were known liabilities, and yet they remained in rotation, and Tamarie was sent into the water anyway. Was it overconfidence, negligence, or something even worse? Because what happened to Tamarie Tollison wasn't just an accident, it was the latest chapter in a long series of close calls. A chain of ignored warnings that had been building for years. She wasn't the first trainer to be pulled underwater by an Orca, but she was the one who survived to remember it. And now, her survival was forcing SeaWorld to face questions they had avoided for far too long. Tamarie's road to recovery began the moment she left the operating room at a San Diego trauma center. Doctors worked for hours repairing the shattered bone in her arm, stabilizing nerve damage, and beginning the long, delicate work of healing. Pins were inserted, ligaments were stitched, but the deepest wounds weren't visible. Over the next weeks, Tamarie entered intensive physical rehab. She had to learn to use her arm again, rebuild strength in her leg, and quietly process the trauma that had nearly taken her life. What had once been second natures, swimming, diving, trusting, now carried the weight of memory, fear, and pain. She didn't speak publicly. She gave no interviews, and quietly, without announcement or farewell, Tamarie Tollison never returned to waterwork with Orca again. Those who worked alongside her at SeaWorld never forgot what they saw that day. Off camera, some trainers later admitted it changed everything. One said, "We all knew it could have been worsened, that scared us." Another remembered watching her pulled from the water limp, bloodied, and thought, "That could have been any one of us." Her body began to heal, but her life had been irreversibly changed, because how do you return to the water when the very animals you once called family nearly ended your life? And more haunting still, what do you do when the world moves on, but you're still living with the silence? Tamarie never made a statement. No memoir, no media tour, just absence, and yet that silence said everything. But inside the stadium, The shows continued. The whales Orchid and Splash remained exactly where they were. Orchid, the same orca who clamped her jaws around Tamara's foot, still performed daily at SeaWorld San Diego. Her name never left the show's schedules, and deep beneath the surface, the questions still swirled, because this story wasn't over, not yet. Her routines were adjusted slightly, but her presence never wavered to the public. Orchid was just another star of the Shamu show. Strong, graceful, obedient, but insiders knew better. Behind the scenes, where cameras didn't roll, a very different story was being written. Later, through public records, requests, and relentless media investigations, internal documents would surface and they told a truth SeaWorld never shared. Orchid had a history. She'd been involved in multiple behavioral incidents prior to July 2002. The attack on Tamarie Tollison was the most serious, but it wasn't the first, and still, no formal announcement was ever made. No press release, no public acknowledgement that a senior trainer had nearly died during a show. And Splash, her poolmate that morning, the second orca involved, continued training for years. Eventually, he was quietly retired from water work, but not because of the attack, not because of disciplinary concerns. Officially, his retirement was attributed to age and health issues. His role in the Tamarie incident was never mentioned. The only public statement SeaWorld released in the aftermath was calculated, cautious, and deliberately vague. It called the incident a training-related accident. No mention of aggression, no mention of emergency recall signals, and certainly no mention that two whales dragged a senior trainer beneath the surface for nearly 30 seconds to the outside world. Nothing unusual had occurred, but behind the stadium walls everything had changed. The orcas that once inspired awe now carried a shadow. Trainers grew more careful, more hesitant, and that unspoken question, what if it happens again, never left the water. The whales remained. The shows continued, but the illusion of safety that was gone, and Tamara's silence that only deepened the mystery. Because if the whales were still performing, and the trainer had vanished, what exactly was SeaWorld trying to protect? And what was the cost of keeping it quiet? In the days following the incident, a brief segment aired on local news. A trainer injured during a routine session. She was being treated. She was recovering. No footage, no interviews, no names, no mention of the orcas involved. The message was controlled tightly. SeaWorld's corporate PR team moved quickly to shape the narrative. Internally, employees were reminded of their non-disclosure agreements, documents that forbade them from discussing incidents with the media. Any questions about the attack were met with the same reply: "We do not comment on internal safety matters." And so, the story faded from headlines, but it never truly disappeared. Years later, as public criticism of marine mammal captivity intensified, Tamarie Tollison's story quietly resurfaced. It gained renewed attention in 2013, when the documentary Blackfish, a light on the psychological toll of captivity and the hidden dangers faced by trainers. Tamarie, single quotes, S name, appeared not because she spoke, she never did, but because what had happened to her had been buried too cleanly. Filmmakers and journalists pieced it together using public logs, medical records, and testimony from former trainers. And what emerged wasn't just a story, it was a pattern. A system that had 4 years placed trainers in dangerous situations. Sand told them to smile through it. Tamarie Tollison's near-death experience wasn't an outlier. It was part of a long, painful history, and her silence, it spoke volumes. No interviews, no return to the spotlight, just a quiet absence, and a name in the logs from that day in July 2002. But that absence became a rallying point, because behind every Orca trick, behind every beaming smile on stage, there was a risk no one wanted to talk about until now. And Tamarie's story, whether she meant it to or not, forced people to start asking, what else has been hidden? And how many more stories like her shave yet to surface? The attack on July 8, 2002 nearly claimed Tamarie Tollison's life, but in the years that followed, her survival quietly reshaped an industry. At first, nothing changed, not publicly. Orchid stayed. In the show's splash remained in the water, and Tamarie's story faded into silence. But behind closed doors, the cracks had begun to form. Then came February 2010. Another senior trainer, Don Broncho, was killed by the Orca Tillicum at SeaWorld Orlando. This time, it happened in front of a live audience. This time, the story couldn't be buried. The public outcry was instant. Headlines dominated the news, and for the first time, SeaWorld faced a level of scrutiny it couldn't deflect. Federal regulators stepped in, sweeping. Changes were ordered across the marine park industry. SeaWorld was forced to revise its safety protocols. Water work with orcas was permanently banned. No more trainers in the water during shows. Platforms were raised, barriers were added, procedures rewritten, the risk finally impossible to ignore. Tamarie Tollison never returned to the pool. She never gave interviews, never made a statement, but her story lingered in every meeting, every risk assessment, every whispered conversation behind the glass walls of SeaWorld. Her name was there in the internal reports, in the warnings. To some, she became a symbol of survival, to others a chilling reminder of how close the system had come to failing her completely, because she wasn't the first, and she wasn't the last. But her survival became a warning, one that could no longer be ignored, and that warning still echoes through the halls of SeaWorld even now. But the question remains, was it enough? Or is there still more lurking beneath the surface, waiting to rise again? Tamarie Tollison nearly lost her lifeline, the very pool she once called home. Her story buried behind headlines, sealed inside internal memos, still speaks volumes about the price of captivity and the cost of silence. If stories like Tamarie's matter to you, subscribe and share. We uncover the truth behind Orca attack stories. World tries to forget because some voices still need to be heard. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.